Entire Mexican state succumbs to cartel narco terrorist organization Urban Ground Combat and releases El Chapo's son after they captured him in a counter drug operation. We'll talk about that and much more on the Rob Manus Show. While many media elites and political opponents of the president scream loudly about his decision to remove less than 50 American ground force troops from the border of northeastern Syria, our own southern border literally has narco terrorism organizations conducting all out ground combat operations against Mexican authorities and civilians just beyond our border. These organizations should be, but have not been designated terrorist organizations by the United States, nor are our elected representatives listening to U.S. Customs and Border Patrol leaders' warnings about their activities along our border and inside the country. Just last week, narco terrorism drug cartels conducted military style ground combat urban operations across the Mexican state of Sinaloa and in that state's capital, forcing authorities to release drug kingpin El Chapo's son, who they had captured in their own counter drug operations. The Trump administration's controversial wall construction could go a long way toward protecting towns along the border, but it's not likely to stop cross border cartel operations without even more defense capabilities focused on these dangerous groups' activities. Our elected officials are often ignoring these because they know they aren't getting any traction with them, especially when opposing the president. But unfortunately for all of us, we've captured nearly 1 million illegals in the last 12 months, so the crimes continue. Fortunately, we have as our guest today an on the ground expert, Mr. Brandon Darby, to walk us through the latest. Mr. Darby is managing director and editor in chief of Breitbart Texas. He co-founded Breitbart Texas Cartel Chronicles Project with senior Breitbart management and Mr. Ildefonso Ortiz. He is the most knowledgeable American regarding cartel narco terrorism activities on the southern border and inside the United States. Brandon Darby, welcome to the Rob Manus Show. Brandon Darby, welcome back to the Rob Manus Show. We appreciate you coming back with us to give us an update on what the heck is going on with the southern border. We saw just about 2 weeks ago, looks like narco terror cartels basically attacked an entire Mexican state and the state capital to get El Chapo's son released after a counter drug operation. You're the only team that really consistently investigates, covers, and reports on cartel activity in Mexico and the southern border region and what they're doing in the United States, along with illegal immigration and those kind of things too. So we wanted to just have you back to talk about the latest cartel activity. Is there any progress being made to stem the tide of this, or can we expect more urban combat operations really closer to our borders?
Well, so this is a tricky question. So are there efforts being done by the administration, by the Trump administration, to better secure the border? And yes, are there efforts being done that have an impact on some cartels? Yes. Are there efforts being done overall that's really having an impact on cartels as a whole, Mexico-based transnational criminal organizations? No, there are not, and that's a sad thing. And there wasn't a lot done during the Obama administration, and there hasn't been a lot done in the Trump administration. I say that as I'm not a never Trumper. I did vote for Trump, and I tend to be critical of him when I need to be and supportive at other times. And so there's not a motivation in saying that other than just to tell the truth, which is our State Department really isn't doing a great job overall in Mexico. The agenda that they have, balancing going after transnational criminal groups with the needs for trade and diplomacy and what have you, that hasn't really shifted during this administration from what was going on during the Obama administration. And we're seeing increased cartel control in Mexico. We're seeing increased influence. We're seeing cases like the one you brought up where El Chapo's son was arrested. That was a situation where a very high-ranking Mexican official on AMLO's cabinet worked with the state AG and the DEA to arrest this person, and the cartel said we're not having any of it, the Sinaloa, and they ultimately kidnapped a number of family members of Mexican military, their children and their wives, and just said, "Hey, we're going to murder your families if you don't let our guy go." And they had some skirmishes. The Mexican government relented and said, "Okay, we'll let him go if you let our families go." They let the families go, and that was a victory for a lot of people call them a drug cartel. We call them paramilitary organizations who are largely funded by drugs, and they have control over territory in Mexico. They have control over most of the mechanisms of government in Mexico at all levels, and that's that's what's happening there. Not a lot has changed. In fact, they've become more emboldened as of late.
Yeah, it seems they have. A question for you. Do you think that if these groups, at least the major ones, were declared as international terrorist organizations, I don't believe any of them are by the United States or any other countries that I'm aware of, would that have an impact on a change in policy for the better to try to have more of an effect against their operations?
Well, so what specifically what you're saying is um, designating them as foreign terrorist organizations. What would the impact be? So some of them, some of the cartels in Mexico do not deserve that designation. Some of them do deserve that designation. They've definitely crossed the line into trying to obtain official governmental control or power. And the problem is this: is if we went after Los Zetas and the Gulf Cartel uh, as foreign terror organizations, that would definitely change things as far as the U.S. how the U.S. approaches it. And the U.S. has a lot of control over what Mexico does, a lot of influence is a better way to say it, influence. But the problem is if we declared all of the large cartels in Mexico as foreign terrorist organizations, Mexico would collapse, and our second largest trading partner would collapse. Our economy would collapse. I mean, because you have to understand that when the State Department, and that's why I have some understanding as to why they do a bad job in Mexico with cartels, and it's because they do have to balance the law enforcement priorities with diplomatic concerns. If the politicians that you are dealing with to make Mexico better and to make incremental changes and to secure our border and to trade our products, if those same politicians are connected to the very cartels you're trying to go after, it does become very difficult. If we were to stop dealing with all politicians connected to corruption and cartels and drug money in Mexico, we would deal with no one in Mexico. Then China would step in, other countries would step in, and then we would have a very bad situation, a much worse situation on our southern border than we currently have. And so there are balances that need to be made with that. But I think, and what I've advocated for many years, is that if we take one or two cartels or one or two factions of certain cartels, like the CDN faction of Los Zetas, which operates south of Texas, and the Reynosa faction of the Gulf Cartel, which also operates south of Texas. And if we made an example of those two factions by declaring them foreign terrorist organizations, I think it would cause other cartels and corrupt networks in Mexico to get in line, to shape up and to stop behaving in the ways that they're behaving. So that's what I advocate for.
Well, I agree with you. You're more of an expert on the specific organizations, and that's where I think we ought to go too. Is target those where we would get the most bang for our buck, so to speak. Because look at what's happening in the world this week. We can do military, special operations all across the entire country of Syria along its border, and take out a guy like al-Baghdadi, like we did Osama bin Laden before. But we're spending all those resources when we have this major issue right on our southern border, and it's really coming into our country, from what I understand, quite frequently. And of course, the tide of illegal immigration and drugs and those kind of things are all and crime are all associated with that. So, has Senator Ted Cruz or Representative Chip Roy or Dan Henshaw, have they tried to address this issue of declaring these groups terrorist organizations?
Well, so Dan Crenshaw, and God bless him and his service, right, his history, but he tends to get the most attention on talking about or tweeting about cartels or the border. But when it comes to the actual work that's being done, I've not seen anyone do more work than Chip Roy when it comes to the House, and I think Ted Cruz, when it comes to the Senate, is very active and very involved and paying a lot of attention. I can't really say that about others who are very vocal. I mean, you have Andy Biggs, or you have others in the House who talk a lot about the border, but when it comes to actually really engaging and really looking into what's occurring. I went on a border trip recently. Here's an example for you. I went on a border trip to the Rio Grande Valley sector. There are a lot of things to know, a lot of things to see for yourself. There's the official tours that the government gives, which are obviously going to be the most rosy that you can get. And then you can go out after that and actually interact with the agents on the ground. Biggs, a number of others were on the trip, but the only one who stayed up and didn't go to bed and who went out with us to the actual border without all of the fanfare and cameras was Chip Roy. The others didn't, and that's a routine thing that we see. Is there? It's very popular on the right to talk about the border. It's very popular to talk about being hard on cartels. But when it all boils down to it, really not a lot of our politicians on the right are that hard on them. It is something that generates resources. It is something that generates attention and funding. But there's really not a lot of people pressing on the issue, calling, trying to understand, asking to meet with sources, asking to really delve into it and devote their resources to this issue. So I do think that, we are lucky when it comes to this issue. I think Border Patrol agents are lucky to have Chip Roy in their corner. I think that they're lucky to have Ted Cruz in their corner. And I think that a lot of them also feel that they have Donald Trump in their corner. He made commitments during his campaign to the National Border Patrol Council, which is their union for the agents. And he's kept those commitments. So they have, during the Obama administration, if agents had a concern, they had to go through their management, their agency management, which at each level are people politically appointed who are trying to make themselves look like they're doing a great job. And that's just natural, what happens in bureaucracy, right? And they didn't have a mechanism to go around that and get directly to the president, and they do during this administration. So that's also an important thing, and you see that the most with the way that the wall or the way that the border barriers are being handled, even though the administration gets a lot of heat from some because they say they built no new wall. Well, that's just not an honest assessment of what's occurred. What occurred is that some of the areas that needed it the most already had a barrier. They had a 5 to 6 foot tall sheet metal barrier, right, called a landing mat. And when when the administration said, agents, what do you want? The agency said one thing, and then the Border Patrol agents said, wait a minute, This is where we're getting assaulted.
Yeah.
Yes, there's a 5 or 6 foot fence there, but we need something more. So that is what the Trump administration started doing, even though it wasn't the most politically expedient for the administration to do. And they left themselves open for uneducated criticism, or criticisms from people with a lack of understanding.
Hmm.
They did what the agents said they needed. And I think that, so there are efforts, like I said, happening. There are people who care, but there's a lot of basic things that we miss. For instance, across the state of Texas, um, Ford F250 trucks are stolen. The reason they're stolen and brought to Mexico is because the cartels need the suspensions in the Ford F250s, because the engines are powerful enough and the suspensions can hold up with all the armor plating that the cartels are welding on, right? The steel sheets that the
Yeah.
plates that the cartels are welding on. Those trucks are being stolen across Texas and brought to Mexico. We all know it. But yet it's not treated as that big of a deal by law enforcement agencies. It's not treated as that big of a deal by the State Department pressuring Mexico to do something and pull over the F-250s, entering Mexico, make sure they're not stolen, make sure they're not switched VINs. And just simply by using available technologies that we have, and look at, utilizing broken windows theory, if we were to track the network stealing those vehicles, track the networks in Mexico where those vehicles are going, which we could very easily do, we could really put a dent in the entire network in Mexico and in the US connected to these drug cartels. But we don't. We treat it as, oh, another car got broken into or stolen. Oh, and we just don't treat it as that big of a deal. But just that alone would open the world up for us to understand the entire networks. If we used advanced cell phone technologies, we could go down the line. We have the ability to take out these cartels. It's just that the willpower to do it is not there.
And that's why I think that designating at least those two groups that you mentioned along the Texas southern border could lead to a lot more capability being brought to bear on these organizations, not just from law enforcement, but also from U.S. military and special operations, because we've got to have permission from Congress to do that. And the president's tried to do what he can do. And I think we have him as president because of his willingness to secure the border, or try to anyway. And I applaud his efforts with the wall and those kind of things too. But we've got to take the next step. And you mentioned it. If we can bring the technology to bear and do common sense things and establish social network intelligence capabilities to track these F-250 thefts and deliveries and conversions down in Mexico. That's not a hard thing to do. We just have to dedicate the resources to get it done and take it seriously. And I got to put a better lock on my F-250, I guess.
Man, mine actually got broken into on the border, near the border. And I was surprised, but when I was there, the police said, hey, just so you know, the chances of your F-250 getting stolen are really high. I'm like, I'm 100 miles from the border. They're like, yeah, but they want them in Mexico. So if I were
Wow.
you, I'd take your fuses out, your ignition fuses, for the night. And I was like, oh my gosh. So that's what actually got me looking into that. And we use all kinds of creepy technologies to map out cartels. And all it takes is for us to have a starting point, to know where one drug runner was, and then we can go from there, to know where one stash house was, and then we can map out things from there. So if we can do that as Breitbart with a limited budget, and a few individuals, then I know our government could do it at a number of different agencies, but they're just not taking it that seriously. They're not treating it as the threat that they should treat it. They're not treating it as the threat that it is, as a threat that has millions of us dying in our communities. Most of our, a lot of people want to say, if we just legalize drugs, well, then blah, 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 or Mexico's drug war is because Americans buy drugs. And it's like, well, if you want to blame people with mental health issues and addiction issues, oftentimes in our poorest communities, for global problems, go right ahead. But I'm going to go ahead and blame the people in high level political office in Mexico who are worth billions of dollars, who are cold, calculated businessmen and capitalists. who are orchestrating this. And I'm not going to blame the like low income person on the street who's addicted to drugs, right? Who has a mental health issue. I think that's
Yeah.
absurd to do that. You know, that's what I think. So, you know, if we had the will, we could do it. We just don't have the will. And that's where people like me and my team members come in, as we, and people like you, is we have a unique position in media with a platform, with our platforms, to encourage government to do the right thing. That is what we can do with our platforms. And that's why it's so important that, like, you're having me on, or hopefully you have others on too, to talk about this issue. It's so important that we keep this issue at the forefront, because these cartels they're operating in our country. And ultimately, we can build a wall, we can do everything in the world that we want to do on that border. But the reality is that our border is really not going to be secure, which means our nation is not going to be secure until we do something about the groups based in Mexico who are operating in our country and sucking off of our country like parasites. If we don't do something about cartels, we're never going to be secure. We're never going to have a truly secure border. Mexico's not going to be okay. And we're just going to continue to have migration crisis after migration crisis. We're going to continue to have illegal immigration problems. We're going to continue to have what we currently have, and it's unacceptable to me, and obviously it is to you, and I think to our fan bases, right, to our listeners and
Mhm.
readers and what have you, and our viewers. It's unacceptable. So we just have to continue to coalesce that into something that pressures the U.S. government, pressures the State Department, pressures local law enforcement agencies to more aggressively go after these people.
Well, I appreciate you coming on with us, Brandon. And I know I follow you on Twitter. And folks, he mentioned Representative Chip Roy of Texas, Chip Roy TX on Twitter. Follow him. Chip's one of my political mentors. When I started looking at trying to do something in political office, and he is a strong, principled American. I don't like using political tags like conservative, but he's a strong, principled American. He believes in what we're doing, and he will get the job done. And he'll bring others along as he has that have maybe have bigger voices like Crenshaw and Senator Cruz to get this work completed to the point where we're not constantly seeing these massive waves of illegals, massive waves of deaths from drugs, and I also agree with you on the let's not blame the folks that have mental health challenges or addiction challenges and those kind of things. Blame the people with the resources. Those are elected officials, appointed officials, high corrupt police officials in the state of Mexico. And then our Congress needs to get off its duff and help us get this job done and devote the resources that we need to it and stop worrying about other places in the world that aren't nearly as much of a vital national security interest as us. So thanks for coming on, Brandon. We appreciate it. And how can folks get follow you and get in touch with you?
Well, just on my Twitter at Brandon Darby. That's the best way to follow me and to follow my team's work. I tweet out most of the links. I tweet out most of our work, and share our stories. Look at our stories. Become educated on the issue. It takes a little time, but not too much time, and understand the impact that cartels are having on our country. And I know it's scary, and I think that's why most U.S. journalists don't cover it, because nobody wants to be the guy or the woman, challenging drug dealers and calling out drug dealers and calling out sex traffickers. But somebody's got to do it. And if you're silent and you do the comfortable thing, which is to ignore it, we're going to continue to see it invade our country. And I'm not talking about migrants. I'm talking about transnational criminal organizations. We're going to continue to see their reach into our country spread, and we're going to continue to have problems. So we got to call it out. I know it's uncomfortable, but we got to call it out. We got to share those stories, and we got to try to mobilize together and unite to do something about the issue. So I do hope people follow me at Brandon Darby on Twitter. I do hope they share the stories, and I do hope they pay attention.
I know we'll keep paying attention, and we'll have you back as soon as we can to get another update because we're going to stay on this and continue to push it and share your stuff and keep communicating with folks like Representative Roy and Senator Cruz and getting our neighbors, our fellow citizens to act on this and encourage our elected officials to act instead of just talking. Brandon Darby from Breitbart, Texas, thank you very much for coming on the Rob Maness Show.
Thank you, sir.
Well, we'd like to thank Mr. Darby for joining us and bringing us up to date on what's going on with illegal immigration and cartel narco-terrorism along and just south of our southern border here in the United States. It's extremely important that we in America get this under control. Until next week, this is the Rob Maness Show.